So thank you for being here. Thank you, Elise Stefanik, for being here. I'm not going to hurt myself, I hope. Okay. Can you hear me in the room? Good. So we're going to talk about NAFTA today. I think it's the main issue that people in the room would like to talk about. And when I lived in your district in 2014, it was very interesting because, as Gary Douglas said, you know, the district and Quebec are really integrated, and your constituents, I met them in the restaurant and at restaurants and things, and they told me about trade with Quebec, about investment from Quebec. I met people who work for Bombardier in the district. I met people who work for Novabus in the district as well. So could you describe to us how your constituents view the current NAFTA negotiations? Are they worried about the renegotiation? And could you tell us a little bit about how this renegotiation could affect constituents in your district?
Sure. So first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to visit today. This is my second or third congressional delegation visit to Canada. I grew up coming to Montreal quite frequently as a kid when I was in school. I actually went to space camp in 6th grade in Montreal. In high school, we did a visit with my high school classmates, and then, of course, personal travel along with professional travel. So I always am so appreciative of the warm welcome. I also want to thank Votre Soulange region for welcoming me, and FCCQ. We had a great breakfast this morning with various business leaders. To your question, Frédéric, I wanted to talk about how the district that I represent has worked incredibly hard to develop cross-border relationships, and that is a testament to the North Country Chamber of Commerce and their partnership and their outreach to Canadian businesses. So I think you have to keep in mind the district I represent is about a third of the geography of New York State. So I represent a very diverse economy, 3 different media markets. It takes me many hours to go from one side of my district to the other. And I think one of the outstanding organizations is made up of the business communities in Plattsburgh, where they've really connected with the average constituent, with the average member of workforce, about the importance of Canadian businesses that have opened up facilities. Bombardier is obviously very well recognized by people just reading the local paper. So I think in my district, people delineate between U.S.-Canada trade and then trade more broadly, which, as you know, this past election cycle at the presidential level, it was quite historic that you had 2 leading candidates that had very, they had sort of anti-trade or critiques of our trading agreements. The fact that you had 2 candidates, I don't think, is reflective of what members of Congress believe. So I do think there is a recognition at the local level of the importance of our partnership, which we can see today. We are friends, we are communities. Plattsburgh has marketed itself as the U.S. suburb of Montreal, which Gary says every time he visits Montreal. And I think the business-to-business relationships are quite successful and a testament to the commitments on both sides of the border.
So in Plattsburgh, people are aware of this border, of the relationship geography helps. Would you say that people in Willsboro, as we go further south, are also very familiar with Quebec? Are they doing business with Quebec also as we go further?
Yeah. As you go further south, I think there is a difference in terms of the awareness. However, I think the tourism aspect, seeing the impact on our local economy because of Canadian tourists, is significant throughout the Adirondacks, throughout my entire district, frankly. I go as far south as Saratoga County. And there is a recognition that our economy and our jobs benefit from our economic partnership with Canada. But I think the specific understanding of the businesses is very unique the closer you get to the northern border.
I remember I was in the district, and you talked about that in 2014, the transportation of oil by train. And I remember your constituents talking about Lac Mégantic. They were talking about the tragedy there. And as you go further, I met with people who knew about Lac Mégantic, talking about Lac Mégantic. So you see that there's this awareness in the district.
There is an awareness. They pay close attention to news that's happening across the border. And when it comes to the oil trains transportation, that was of concern, particularly to the Champlain Valley, when you have very high-speed trains going through small towns and villages right along the lake. And obviously, our environment in the North Country is parallel to our economic growth. It's one of the ways we can attract tourists, not just from across the country in the U.S., but across the border.
So let's go back to the NAFTA negotiations. The negotiations began a few months ago, and there was a general sense on this side of the border that the U.S. and Canada would be able to find common ground, sign maybe a new agreement, a NAFTA 2.0, rather quickly. When Prime Minister Justin Trudeau met with the U.S. President in February 2017, Donald Trump pledged publicly that to only tweak Canada's side of NAFTA. But now we've seen the negotiations, and I would say that there's a growing concern in Canada and in Quebec that the negotiations might not be going well after all, that the U.S. might terminate NAFTA. At least that's what maybe the president has said sometimes about NAFTA. How do you see the current process going? What's going to happen with that according to you?
So I do not support termination of NAFTA. I understand in my district and broadly within the U.S. how much we benefit from a positive economic partnership. I believe that the recent decisions to prolong the process is a step in the right direction, because I think we have identified that this is a critical issue to our domestic economy and we need to get it right. I think that the first rule going into negotiations and as we continue the talks is do no harm. Keep what is working, but certainly modernize aspects that are frankly out of touch with the 21st century. So for example, digital rules of the road. That's an aspect of NAFTA that absolutely needs to be updated. I know from the US perspective, we're very focused on market access. That's something that my district is also very aware of, whether it's dairy farmers or whether it's wine producers, being able to have access to Canadian markets. So I do think, I know there is a lack of certainty and some trepidation about reading in the news what's going on during these talks, but I am, from my perspective, I think we need to strengthen the agreement and modernize it and not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
What, as a member of Congress, what can you do in the House of Representatives to try to make this heard, to try to make this visible, this kind of argument visible in Washington, but also in your district? What can you do to try to influence the White House on issues like that? Is there something you can do, and what are you doing on this?
So it's a great question. I think the way that we effectively educate our constituencies is by connecting them to jobs in their region. So touring Bombardier, touring Nova Bus, making sure that there's local media coverage of the importance of these investments in the region. Our local chambers of commerce have done a great job in getting that message out there to the readership and to voters in the district. In terms of working with the administration, I'm part of the Northern Border Caucus, and many of our members, very bipartisan, both Republicans and Democrats, have worked together.
Excuse me, can you tell us more about the caucus? Because I'm not sure that people in the audience know what it is and what it does.
Yes, so there are a number of caucuses, which are groupings of members of Congress who focus on particular policy issues. The Northern Border Caucus has a Republican co-chair and a Democratic co-chair. So it's very bipartisan, but it's made up of members of Congress along the northern border. So you have members from Washington State, from Montana, from Michigan, from New York, to make sure that our voices are heard. And it matters when we're legislating issues like the pre-clearance agreement. The way we can leverage that group of members is by communicating with the administration the importance of our trading partnership with Canada. We have done so through official letters where, frankly, those letters are measured by how many signatories you can get from members of Congress. And again, these are bipartisan letters that we've submitted. Also, behind the scenes, there are a lot of conversations going on between the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, which is the committee that has jurisdiction over trade in the House, and the administration to assure that we're moving in a positive direction towards modernizing and strengthening NAFTA. So those are ongoing. In terms of congressional role, I believe that any decision regarding trade, whether it's entering into a trade agreement or making a decision to exit a trade agreement, Congress has an important role and has jurisdiction. We vote for Trade Promotion Authority, which allows administrations to negotiate and enter into trade agreements. I believe that if there were a decision made by the administration, which I don't think is going to happen, but if there were, Congress would have constitutionally the authority to be a part of that before that goes into effect.
So there was a law also that was adopted in 1994, a congressional executive agreement that was adopted when the first NAFTA trade deal was made. And sometimes on this side of the border, people forget that the system in the US is very different from the system we have in Canada. So we pay a lot of attention to what's being said in the White House and things, but we often forget that Congress, members of Congress like you would have an opportunity, the occasion to say things on NAFTA. Should there be a new NAFTA 2.0 and things like that?
Yes.
So, and that's what we organized a conference on November 9 on the first 10 months of Donald Trump in the White House, and we had the opportunity to listen to Christopher Sands. He's a professor at Johns Hopkins University, and he told us about what's the role of the president in trade negotiations, and Congress would have a very important role to play, as you just mentioned. But also, he told us, and you alluded to that, he told us that because we tend to be a little pessimistic on this side of the border regarding NAFTA negotiations, but Christopher Sands told the audience that there could be opportunities in the renegotiation process, and you mentioned e-commerce and things like that. So where do you see, what are the opportunities, and what are the opportunities? Are there opportunities to enhance the U.S.-Canadian economic partnership within the negotiation, or what could be done in the future from your perspective to enhance that trade relation?
I think regulatory reforms is an area that we can pursue that would be a win-win for both Canada and the U.S. and provide more certainty for our businesses on both sides of the border. Again, updating our digital rules of the road to make sure that we exist in the 21st century economy. And I think also just taking a look at industries that have changed. An example is, it's not an industry, but it's agriculture in my district. We have a growing wine, we have a lot of wine in my district.
And it's pretty good.
And it's good,
Oh, yeah.
but we don't have access, whereas Canadian wine producers do have access to the U.S. markets. So we're looking to focus on economic growth. How can we continue to promote this trading of goods and services? I do think there are positive opportunities to move in a more mutually beneficial direction than have been reported in the media.
You also mentioned the fact, or it was mentioned before, sorry about that, I have two microphones, it's very difficult to move right now. It's like, shh. So we know that I cannot move. We know that there's a lack of awareness and appreciation in the US and in Congress for how important the US-Canadian economic partnership is for Americans and for Canadians. You're doing a wonderful job in the 21st District. Is there something more that can be done at this point by the Quebec government, by the Canadian government, by private actors in Quebec? And also, do you feel that more should be done in states that were carried by Donald Trump in 2016, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan? I saw this article that was published a few days ago in which the article was basically saying that many of those states actually benefit from NAFTA, but voted for Trump and for more protectionism when it comes to Canada-U.S. relations. So do you think that more should be done to raise awareness? And what can we do to...
It's a great question. This came up in my breakfast this morning. I think businesses should make the case to whoever their members of Congress are across the border in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, about how our U.S.-Canada trading partnership benefits local jobs. Because I represent the U.S. And my goal is to strengthen our economy and create jobs locally. Part of that is making the case why our investment from our Canadian businesses in the region benefits jobs. And those jobs on average pay significantly more than other jobs in the region. The best way to communicate that with members of Congress is to show them in their district how many thousands of jobs benefit. And I think there should be a particular focus on states that President Trump, then candidate Trump's message resonated. Again, he won many of the Rust Belt Midwestern states. And I think that's an area where you could focus your efforts. Because in New York, you can continue to work with New York, of course, but we have, I think, successfully, thanks to the North Country Chamber, have built the model of educating our workforce about why this partnership is beneficial.
When we held this conference on November 9, Christopher Sands also told us that we should pay attention to the fiscal reform that's being debated in Congress right now. Can you tell us a little bit about what's at stake in this reform and how this could affect Canada-U.S. relations? Is there a way it could affect us? And because we pay attention to NAFTA, but I had this discussion with my friends here, and it was not in the questions we sent you. So I'm sorry if
That's okay. I'm happy to talk about it. Happy to talk about it.
Yeah, I know. I'm sure you're paying attention to the fiscal reform as well. How could this affect trade between Canada and the U.S. and businesses in Canada and in Quebec in particular?
Sure. So the tax reform package?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. The tax reform package, earlier this year, one of the policy ideas that was being discussed was this idea of a border adjustment tax. I spoke out against that proposal and that provision in terms of what the impact would be in my region. Earlier this morning, a gentleman, a business leader, had a great way of describing this partnership. It's not about trading together, it's about making things together. Think about how many goods to manufacture go across the border over a period of a day or a week to manufacture whatever is being made on the U.S. or Canadian side. So the border adjustment tax, because so many members spoke out against it, that was taken out of the proposal, which I think is very beneficial to this audience. That would have had a detrimental impact on our trading partnership. The other issue that will have an impact is the U.S. lowering of the corporate tax rate, which is an aspect of the tax bill that I agree with. Again, we need to focus on U.S. competitiveness in the global economy, and we have one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world, and that was one aspect of the tax bill. There are other domestic issues that are at play right now. From my perspective, I represent a very high-taxed state in New York, and currently individuals are able to deduct when they file their federal taxes, their state income taxes, and that would be going away in this proposal. So I voted no, but there are aspects of the tax bill that I agree with, such as cutting the corporate tax rate. That's going to improve U.S. competitiveness globally. Maybe
one more question before we give the audience the opportunity to ask a few questions too. So in the last few months, experts of NAFTA have often said that complaints in the U.S. about this trade deal have largely been about Mexico and less about Canada. And there's a debate on this side of the border between those who say our government should make sure this negotiation remains a three-party process, and those who think Canada should insist on separating U.S.-Canada negotiations from the U.S.-Mexico ones. So do you think a bilateral renegotiation would make more sense for Canada? Do you think that the current process is leading towards that kind of negotiation, or?
So I'm not physically at the talks. I think that what we've seen from this president is he does like the bilateral trade negotiation process. That those are indications that he's made, for example, in the Asia Pacific, and his decision to exit out of the TPP talks and instead pursue bilaterals. I believe my position is I think NAFTA needs to say trilateral, but I think as Canadians are participating in these talks, you should continue to assert the differences between the U.S.-Canada trading partnership, which is more co-equal than, for example, U.S. with Mexico and the trade deficit we face with Mexico. I also think many of the border issues similar to trade, I always try to educate my colleagues on how the northern border issues we face are very different than southern border issues. And we need to have unique solutions for both, but we can't just group them together. I think the same goes for trade.
Thank you. We have some time for questions, if you may. Nous avons donc des micros. Je pense qu'il y a un micro juste à l'arrière, donc vous pouvez déjà peut-être vous y rendre si vous avez des questions à poser à Mme Stefanik. Est-ce qu'on a des questions? Oui, allez-y. Voulez-vous vous rendre au micro? Ou just,
No,
yeah, you can
what
ask
is
a
your
question.
reading at the Senate level about this negotiation?
Well, I'm not in the Senate. I mainly work with my House colleagues. I think from the Senate's perspective, my key advice would be to talk to the senators from the states that benefit so much from trade. I think they have quite a number of issues on their agenda right now. They're working through the tax reform package. So I haven't been engaged with the senators on this issue.
Quelqu'un d'autre? Allez-y, monsieur.
Thank you again for your support of manufacturing in Canada and the U.S. One of the things I wanted to talk about, you talked about making things together. We'd like to talk about what we call the innovation chain.
There you go.
He has a better question than I do. We talk about the innovation chain, which is the free flow of ideas, people, engineers, technicians, purchasing people, suppliers, customers, moving across the border seamlessly to create better products, working with New York City, working with Toronto, working with San Antonio. It drives products that could not be made by one manufacturer. So perhaps in your discussions, if you could maybe get people to think about the free flow of people as well and the importance of integrating our two economies, because it will drive benefits for the U.S. and for Canada. So I wonder if you have any suggestions on how we might make that
so
case.
I think that our relationship on the northern border actually exemplifies that balance we've been able to strike, which is maintaining appropriate levels of border security while still ensuring that there is economic commerce that's quite consistent, whether it's the nexus lane or some of the provisions in the pre-clearance legislation that we passed in Congress that I'm hopeful that will pass in Canada soon. That will help modernize that balance right now. But it's certainly something that we'll continue to talk about with our local chambers and local businesses. Thank you.
On a encore quelques minutes pour des questions. Quelqu'un veut y aller d'une question? Vous avez encore 2 petites secondes. 1, 2. Elise Stefanik, thank you so
Merci.
much.